What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to talk about Harlem, New York with you. In order for me to have that dialogue, I must go back to its grassroots. I must go back to the beginning. But in this conversation, you're going to learn about some of the greatest black fighters of all times. Some of the greatest entertainers and politicians, actors and actresses. Some of the greatest monuments. And some of the greatest times that were spent in Harlem, New York. Now, during the American Civil War, Harlem was a draft location. In 1868, the community became somewhat of a survival location, serving New Yorkers from all over the region as refuge. The dominant ethnic groups were Jewish, Italians, and poor working classmen. The frustration of the residents in 1875 caused Harlem to drop in value of 80%. And this caused homes and factories, churches, and many members to annex in a declining community as far north as 155th Street. Now, 155th Street was known as the Polo Grounds. It was given that name because that was the location where you would play polo, horse polo. It has a very rich history. Now, the black community residents have been members of this community since 1630, between 125th to 130th Street. By the 1900s, tens of thousands of black families have lived in Harlem. According to the studies, the black communities grew firmly into the surrounding areas in 1904. And during another real estate crash, landlords could not seem to find white tenants for their properties. So here comes Philip Payton. He was a real estate mogul. His company was called Afro-American Realty. And Philip Payton bought black residents up from Tenderlands and San Juan Hills, is now known as Lincoln Center. Hell's Kitchen, which is Midtown Manhattan, Greenwood Village, Lower East Side, and the Bowery. Now, in 1907, black churches began to be placed between 134th and 138th Street. Some of the wealthiest churches in Harlem were placed there. St. Mark's Methodist Church, Edgecombe Avenue Church, and Salem Crescent Methodist Church. In the basement of that church would be the Salem Crescent Club. And you would find one of the greatest trainers in boxing history. And one of the greatest fighters was produced in that club. The trainer was Harry Wiley Sr., who we will be talking about soon. As well as Walker Smith. Some know him as Smitty. But the boxing world would know him as the great Sugar Ray Robinson. Now, Oscar Hammerstein had opened the Harlem Opera House, which is located on East 125th Street in 1889. Now, in the mid-1930s, middleweight champion Harry Smith, he was a colored middleweight champion, one of the greatest of all times, defeated Jack McVeigh. I'll get into his career in a moment. He would get 3 inspired boxers a job at the Harlem Opera House. Now, one of those fighters was 2-time New York Golden Gloves champion, Walker Smith, better known as Sugar Ray Robinson, who was also known as Smitty, those closest around him. Would also give a job to heavyweight amateur star Danny Cox. My grandfather told me many stories as he was friends with Danny Cox. He would also give job to lightweight amateur star Louis Valentine. He would be known as Louis Spider Valentine in 1939 when he faced the great Sugar Ray Robinson, who was Walker Smith. In 1939, featherweight Golden Gloves. In 1893, many rows of houses were not enough to house the residents. So later that year, the construction was a delay in the subway construction due to real estate decline. And this situation had brought in Eastern Europeans, Jews and Italians, who saw opportunities. Now, according to studies, the Jewish community of 12 in Harlem in 1869, that would eventually grow to over 200,000 in about 1915. 1915 would be the year that colored heavyweight, world heavyweight champion Jack Johnson would lose his title to Jess Willard and Cuba Havana. But the blacks and Jews were pressed to stop from moving in the neighborhoods. And the Jews, unfortunately, would have signs put up at their door, "No dogs allowed." Amazing. Over 150,000 Italians in Harlem. 1907, City College of New York was built, and 90% of students were Jewish, and the graduates were at the top of their class. Italian mafia, along with Jewish families, emerged in East Harlem and soon expand in operations of racketeering. Now, the Jewish population began to dwindle, and by 1930, only 5,000 Jewish residents remained. Now, 1930 was with the end of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance began in 1918. Now, Harlem played an important role in America's Revolution. When the British came to the U.S., they landed in Manhattan, and they established base there in operations of Lower Manhattan. George Washington stopped those troops from controlling Harlem because black soldiers had helped control the area. They lost a lot of lives, and unfortunately, they're not credited for their contribution in making this happen. And most of this happened in Morris Park because that was the highest grounds. And the black soldiers would help to build the monumental steps that would lead up to the top of the monument. Incredible construction that was built at that time. Now, September 16, 1776, the battles in Harlem Heights, Fort Western Harlem, Harlow Way, which is known as West 125th Street. There were conflicts with Morningside Heights to the south and Harlem Heights to the north. And the U.S. troops were outgunned by 5,000 men. And they were ill-equipped. But in 1907, black churches would play a very important role in the African American communities. Central Harlem was about 10% black population, 1910. 1910 was a very distinguishing year. Now, in boxing history, 1910 meant a great deal because Stanley Ketchel, the Michigan assassin, was killed and murdered by Walter Dipley. He was the middleweight champion at that time. And unfortunately, for Sam Langford, he didn't get a rematch opportunity with Stanley Ketchel because of the passing. But it'll also be the year that Jack Johnson would face Jim Jeffries, the Boilermaker. He would fight him in Reno, Nevada. And he would give him one of the greatest 15-round beatings known to man. And because of this, little black boys were beaten to death. Men were hung. It would start a Harlem riot. It would be chaos because of Jim Crow. 1930, over 50 fighters would come from Harlem. The NAACP, Marcus Garvey, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. 1916, the NAACP became the largest chapter for black improvement organizations in the country. And thanks to Marcus Garvey, 1910 would be a very monumental year. A. Philip Randolph created the newspaper called The Messenger. In 1917, he organized the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. W.E.B. Du Bois, major contribution. The Savoy Manor was located on 141st and 140th Street. Now, Harlem, New York, you would find 24-year-old drummer by the name of Chick Webb would play a major contribution in that community. And we'll discuss him in a moment. And between 1926 and 1935, you would have two of the most eloquent jazz and cabaret nightclubs, one block away from one another, the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom. Now, the Cotton Club was a Harlem nightclub which opened to white establishments 1923 to 1935 on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue. Now, this famous nightclub would serve only to white paying audience, and some at that time had great black and white entertainers that money could buy, such as Bunny Goodman and Bill Bojangles Robinson, Ethel Waters, Cab Calloway, the Nicholas Brothers. Black entertainers such as Louis Armstrong, Lena Horne, and Josephine Baker would entertain at those clubs. Former colored heavyweight and world heavyweight champion Jack Johnson had rented the top floor at the Supper Club in 1920. Had a great businesses going until 1923 when a prominent gangster and bootlegger took over the club, basically strong-arming the establishment. When he was released from Sing Sing in 1923, you see, Oni Madden, he heard about this well-established and well-ran establishment was making money from prostitution, gambling, and liquor, as well as entertainment was concerned. Now, the Cotton Club was prohibition, had a huge black market of liquor, and it was a place where you can have a great time. Now, the Walker Law had been established by a senator, which allowed boxing to become legal in many states. You would have the New York SAC, New York State Athletic Commission, to legally license fighters, and fighters would reestablish their boxing careers. And Harlem's own Johnny Wilson was a middleweight champion in 1920, and he would lose his title in 1923. Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. Now, this was first established, and the first fights that would be fought under that new law would be Joe Willing and Joe Dundee. It was repealed under the Farley Law. Now, the Hurley boxing law had passed in 1918. It was in New Jersey. It was legalized in boxing. Just to step back a moment, 1918 had began what was called the Harlem Renaissance. And you would have some of the greatest entertainers, art forms, dancers, singers that you could ever imagine. We will get into that in one moment. Now, meanwhile, one block away from the Supper Club was another establishment called the Savoy Ballroom. It was located between 140th and 141st Street and Lenox Avenue from 1926 to 1950. The Savoy Ballroom was a place to be from New Yorkers all over the city. Now, there was a hunchback 24-year-old drummer. I had mentioned him before. His name was Chick Webb, and he would host many great entertainers such as Louis Armstrong, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, Lena Horne, the great Nicholas Brothers, who were famous for the Lindy Hop. 1935, Joe Louis will face a former heavyweight champion, Max Baer, with a fourth-round knockout. And he would visit the Savoy Ballroom many times. 1934, a young 19-year-old female jazz singer would stand into a big stage. She was frightened to death, so frightened that she would forget her words. Her name would be Ella Fitzgerald, and she would be standing on a brand new stage of the Apollo Theater, located on 125th Street. She would land a main stop at an outstanding spot with Chick Webb at the Savoy Ballroom. And meanwhile, Sarah Vaughan would land a spot at Birdland's famous jazz nightclub. Now, Joe Louis and his many starlets, Calloway, with the Heidi Heidi Ho, the famous Nicholas brothers, Sandman Silly, Faynard, Dorothy, and Harold Nicholas was a Nicholas family. But Faynard and Harold would be the greatest dancers, in my opinion, in the history of life. Now, you could debate Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, but I would have to say it would be the Nicholas brothers. And you would also have Gene Kelly, Sammy Davis Jr., the Berry Brothers, the famous Panama Hattie, 1942. Now, Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, John Henry Lewis, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, and Glenn Miller would be the sounds they would listen to. They would all listen to Chick Webb on drums, Mario Bozzara on trumpet, Sandy Williams on trombone, Elmer Williams on tenor sax, Taft Jordan on saxophone, and Pete Clarkson on clarinet. And Chick Webb would have a large picture of his face on a bass drum. And they wore three-piece suits, shiny shoes, slick hair, and bow ties. The famous Foxtrot swinged walk was a famous dance in that particular setting. Lindy Hop was performed by the greatest dancers, Leon James, Al Mims, and Frankie Manning, Norma Miller, and Chaz Young, Herbert Whitey White. Now, William Ward, his name was Kit Norfolk. He was born September 20th, 1895 in Norfolk, Virginia. Traveled to Baltimore, Maryland, 1910, for action in a famous battle royale, where you would see 4 to 8 young black boys, sometimes mixed with grown men. They were all blindfolded, and sometimes with chili pepper powder. It was used in their cloths in the blindfold to make sure that the participants did not attempt to open their eyes. You know, as I go back in history, it's tear-jerking to tell these stories because it is a rich history. But it just goes to show you. That's why I wanted to talk about Harlem, because of the struggles that many of the participants has really gone through. And what this did, after the participants would react, and you had the drunken white men who would actually watch this fiasco go on, it wouldn't end until the last man was standing. And when the young boys and men would remove their blinds, chili pepper would fall into their eyes, and they would jump up and down like jackrabbits, like human jackrabbits, rubbing their eyes because it was burning them that much. And this would be entertainment at the expense of these young boys. Amazing. They would be bruised and cut and battered. And the cuts would be burning. And their eyes would be tearing. Only to have a few pennies thrown at them. Some of these fighters that participated in these events were Jack Johnson, who would turn out to be the colored heavyweight champion. 1903, when he defeated Edward Ed Martin. World heavyweight champion in 1908, when he would defeat Tommy Burns after chasing him around the world, landing him in Sydney, Australia. George Dixon was a Canadian who would win the featherweight, bantamweight champion. He would discover shadow boxing. Had over 1,000 fights. Unbelievable. 18. Hard to tell these stories. He would have sticks and bricks thrown at his legs to keep him from going against the ropes. And that's where he become great at boxing, in the center of the ring. He would fight a man by the name of Jack Skelly, who's an amateur star, never had a professional fight in his career. It would be part of the carnival of boxing. And because he beat him up, you wouldn't have blacks fighting whites in the South for over 50 years. In fact, the first bout that took place after that would be in 1952. That would be between Kid Gavilan and a man by the name of Bobby Dykes. Phenomenal. Also participants were Joe Gans, greatest lightweight outside of Benny Leonard of all times. He invented the jab. Jack Blackburn is a trainer of Joe Louis. Kid Norford, who we're going to be talking about in a moment. He's a color light heavyweight champion, had his wars with Lee Anderson, Alabama Kid, etc. And Tiger Flowers, who would become the first black middleweight champion after he defeated Harry Greb in 1926. So they all went through this. All great black fighters from the South. William Ward was part of a few men who were brought over to Panama to entertain the soldiers and sailors on the Panama Canal. An engineer named V.A. Mason took William Ward to Panama, but was not able to get fights for him. 1913, 1914, Ward would fight a famous white fighter who was said to have had over 1,000 fights. His name was Abraham Halansky. He defeated him in 20 rounds. 1915. Now, Kid Norford would be faced black fighters such as Jeff Clark, Joplin Ghost, who was better known as an outstanding fighter. Norford would win and lose in a regain contest. Would face a Panama heavyweight, Black Gunbo Smith, who he knocked out, as well as Big Bill T. Now, Kid Norford would score 2 knockouts from former White Hope contenders, Arthur Perkley. This victory would introduce him to trainer Leo P. Flynn. Now, Leo P. Flynn would then bring Norford over to the U.S., where he would reside in Harlem, New York. In 1917, December 17, he would face Sam Langford, and he would be stopped by Sam Langford in the first round. He was dropped and eventually knocked out. And this would teach him a valuable lesson. You see, I have Sam Langford, the greatest fighter of all times, #1 ranked in my all-time list. Sam Langford, I told his story. Look up Sam Langford Scrapbook Boxing. Went through the struggles as well. And the Kid Norford would jump from light heavyweight to heavyweight division. And he would face an opportunity to have it out with Jack Dempsey. Manager Leo P. Flynn would write letters to light heavyweight champion battling Levinsky. St. Paul's heavyweight contender, Tommy Gibbons. And they would all never respond to that letter. 1918, Leo P. Flynn tried to negotiate offers with Jack Hearns for a fight with Jack Dempsey. And Dempsey and Kearns would claim that they would be in line to face Jess Willard, 1919, for the heavyweight championship of the world. And there would be no funds available. Now, July 19th, Dempsey would KO Willard in the 4th round. It was such a brutal contest. He would break the face in 2 pieces, break the ribs in 3 pieces. 6 teeth would be knocked out. Broken eye socket of Jess Willard. Jess Willard would never be the same. And Kid Norford had wanted to face Jack Dempsey even more now, saying, I see his weakness. What a fighter he was. I wanted him now. I believe the ducking game has started with Jack Dempsey and the Black Fighters. When he was scheduled to face KO Bill Brennan, 1920. Panama Joe Gans and Kid Norford was set to schedule a sparring session to help prepare Bill Brennan for Jack Dempsey. And they were both told to take it easy on Bill Brennan. Just work with him, and that's your job. Panama Joe Gans found it so easy to handle Bill Brennan that he would jab him half to death, leaving his eyes swollen and his ribs sore. And a spy from Jack Dempsey's camp would witness Kid Norford sparring another white fighter, somewhat doing the same damage to him, and he would go back to Jack Dempsey and say, Jack, there's no way we're going to put you in there with these black fighters. They're too good. July 2nd, 1921, Jack Dempsey would face George Carpentier. One of the most popular fights at that time. You see, George Carpentier was a light heavyweight champion. He would lose his title to Battling Siki. Battling Siki would unfortunately have a controversial victory over George Carpentier, stating that he was a knee to the groin. He would eventually lose his title to another fighter that would duck black fighters. And his name was Mike McTeague. Lost to him in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day. But the fight with Jack Dempsey and George Carpentier had grossed $1,789,238. Now you tell me. Kid Norford wanted a shot, but he couldn't get a shot with Dempsey. So in 1921, he would face the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. Now he would face John Lester Johnson, who called him during the referee's instructions. He called him a Willie boy. Those were fighting words. After handling John Lester Johnson, 18 fights later, he would face Harlem's own color light heavyweight champion, Leo Anderson. Leo Anderson was a fascinating fighter himself, and that would be a war. And after Leo Anderson would thumb Kid Norford in the eye, it would be a 5,000 spectators at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. And Kid Norford would face Harry Greb. Greb would suffer a flash knockdown in the very first round. Now here's the controversy with Greb and Kid Norford. You have so many different stories about that fight. You have stories where Kid Norford was constantly fouling Harry Greb. And when Harry Greb wanted to retaliate, he was disqualified. The other story was Harry Greb was constantly fouling Kid Norfolk until the referee had enough and disqualified Harry Greb. Incredible. Now, you had 1 and 2 fights. One was in 1921, one was in 1924. And you split those controversies between 2 fights, and that's what you had. But they were gruesome fights. And Kid Norfolk had outweighed Harry Greb between 11 and 13 pounds. And unfortunately for Harry Greb, a thumbing would be placed in the eye, unfortunately, for Harry Greb. And he would fight 47 more fights before the end of his career, blind in one eye. I have Harry Greb ranked number 2 as the greatest fighter of all times. His last fight, Kid Norfolk would face be Tommy Gibbons. He would be stopped in 6 rounds at New York's Madison Square Garden. Kid Norfolk was way past his prime at that time. But he would be intelligent enough to invest his money in real estate market, along with Jack McVeigh and Harry Wills, as well as Harry Smith. He would never be entered